Guys, today we have on Alex B, one of my homies. He's been on before, so go back and listen to that if you want more context. Today we're going to jump into ARKs and scaling Bitcoin. Alex, I remember early on when the Ark original white paper launched. When was that? Like maybe 2 years ago now?
It's been a little more than 2 years now. One thing special about Ark is there was not really any white paper also, right?
Okay.
So yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Okay. So I remember at the time, I follow you off. I definitely read most of your tweets. Like I've looked to you as one of the more kind of pragmatic Bitcoiners. And I think when Ark came out, you seemed extremely excited. And I think you wrote something along the lines of Ark could be like the most interesting innovation since Lightning for Bitcoin. So yeah, like what was if you want to explain Ark, and then also like what got you super excited about this versus all of the myriad other kind of scaling solutions that we've tried thus far and have gained traction. What was it about Ark that got you like really excited?
Well, as I mentioned, there was really no white paper for Ark or any kind of like formal specification when the protocol was announced. So what I've come to realize over the last couple of years, and specifically the last year working on Ark actively with the team that's implementing it, is really that this was more kind of a napkin paper proposal than anything. The one thing that it had going for it, the one thing that was really truly innovative that is that it did bring new technical approaches that had not existed in Bitcoin yet. Things like, we don't have to get into the details of it, but things like the connector output, which are things that since then have kind of like been used in the context of, or at least, used in the context of things like BitVM and whatnot.
Yeah.
So there was truly kind of like a breakthrough in the way that how you'd be able to construct Bitcoin transaction. And it actually took, at first, I would say I probably didn't understand the protocol very well. And I was giddy because there seemed to be finally some kind of new complement perhaps to Lightning. I never really saw it. It was advertised kind of like as an alternative to Lightning. I never really saw it that way. But the idea that we had perhaps a new paradigm for scaling that was completely different from every existing solution, whether it was channel based like Lightning, or whether it was like kind of like even, that I've always looked at Ethereum and looking at what was happening over there. And it was also kind of like not resembling anything like rollups and whatnot. So it was really novel. It had a bit of a lore around it. The originator was kind of a bit of a quirky character. But all that to say is, leading up to now, I think to me, it's clearer than ever that this introduction of Ark and the core sort of foundation of the Ark protocol are probably going to be just as important to Bitcoin as kind of like, rollups and validity and optimistic proofs were to Ethereum. We're truly entering kind of like a new range of scaling solutions for Bitcoin that are going to bring about not only, scaling payments, which was kind of like the original goal, I think, of the creator, but bringing about a new level of programmability around the asset, and in a way that really, at least this is where it aligns with Lightning, right? Does not compromise in terms of self-custody, and always allows users to, does not introduce counterparty risk, which a lot of the, current and existing scaling solutions do. So, in terms of how Ark works, we've done a lot of work. And, I was on the pod with you, so I probably, I don't know last time I was on the pod, whether or not I riffed a little bit about.
No, not that much. Not that much.
I don't think we did, right? So, anyways, the core approach of Ark, which we've kind of refined and we formalized into kind of a light paper with a university out of Switzerland in the last couple of months, is this notion of transaction batching on Bitcoin and the ability to really commit a large number of transactions into a single compressed form, right? And when I say things like that, this is something that's going to be very intuitive and has been actually very intuitive for people from the Ethereum industry and the Ethereum technical groups to understand, because this is precisely what rollups do, right? Putting aside some of the technical implementation about what type of proofs they use, and what kind of bridge structure they have, ultimately the goal of a rollup is really to have off-chain execution happening, and to be able to basically compress the data coming from that off-chain execution and the associated transactions, trades, swaps, whatever you have, into a sort of layer one commitment that effectively, checkpoints the balance and the transaction history of every single users within that system, so that, whenever you have a proof that's published to Ethereum, therefore everyone's balance is committed to the layer one, and then users get some sort of guarantee that they're able to move their money in and out of that system. So Ark achieves something very similar to this. And this is why, over the last couple of months, and really since late last year, we started taking a different approach to Ark that was more so focused on this notion of execution layer. Because our idea was, okay, we have core primitives and this ability on chain to do these batch transaction system. And how do we actually build the commercial platform on top of it? How do we create a product that people can actually use to build, and not only, again, going away from not going away, but certainly kind of opening up the scope of possibilities beyond the original proposition of simply scaling Bitcoin payments. So effectively, this is what we created with Arkade, which Arkade really is kind of our implementation of a layer 2, using the Ark protocol as the foundational sort of like settlement layer. And it creates, again, an architecture that is quite similar and very similar to something like rollups, where you have an operator. So it's a client-server model, the same way that rollups are, and therefore you have an operator that allows you to effectively sequence, order off-chain transactions, and then again, once I would say periodically, the state of the off-chain user balances gets committed to the layer 1. Now, the big difference really is that because rollups are effectively, or at least most rollups really, I know that UTXO rollups are possible, but they're not very popular. And so most rollups, are based on like a global state, right? So it's effectively another blockchain. You're, effectively carrying this thing, all of this data around that needs to perhaps in some cases replicated across a set of validators. And the operator of the rollup is actually the one that is responsible for committing, the state of the L1 of the off-chain system to the layer 1. So they do that periodically by posting state diffs and all that, technical jazz and whatnot. The major difference with a system like Arkade is we kind of like flip that on its head, because yes, we are a UTXO based system from the ground up, meaning that all of our stuff is, we call it virtual UTXOs, meaning that these are effectively all sets of pre-signed Bitcoin transactions that were, again, executing off chain and then compressing in a compact batch format into the layer 1. But what happens is that the operator no one really keeps a global. I mean, the operator obviously has a database of all of it, the associated users and all the virtual UTXOs. So he does have a sense of a global state, but the users themselves are not concerned with the global state of the system. They're only concerned, just like they are in Bitcoin, with their set of UTXOs, right? And so what happens is that the users are actually the one deciding when to commit the state of, say, the off-chain virtual UTXOs onto the layer 1. So this allows something that's, much more flexible than the traditional rollup approach, where, the operator effectively decides when you commit that state to L1. Whereas on Arkade, once you receive funds and whatnot, you do some trades, a couple of swaps here and there. And then you decide whether or not you want to have true finality on your, set of transactions, or whether you want to continue operating in the off-chain environment. And, there's a bit of a dependency there. And it's a bit of the same dependency that exists in every roll up again, right? Like you don't have a guarantee that unless, in between state commitments on the layer one, you don't actually have a guarantee about the sequencing of events, right? And obviously all of these systems have kind of, security architecture in place so that if for whatever reason the operator tries to cheat, someone tries to cheat, so at least they're not able to actually get the money out of the bridge that's associated with that, right? So a bunch of systems of optimistic proof challenges and all of this. Whereas again, with a system like Arkade, the major difference really is like, okay, well, I can decide to post a commitment in a batch in the next Bitcoin block. And the moment that I do that, I don't have any more trust dependency on the operator, right? I have full Bitcoin finality. All of my coins have a perfectly secure unilateral exit path that I can enforce on chain at all time. So from a security perspective, there are major differences. Obviously, there's a lot of things we could get into. The fact that it doesn't require bridges, right? We're really only talking, and this is where it's a lot more similar to something like Lightning. It's only sets of pre-signed transactions that you coordinate between the user and the operator. And this opens up this execution space for you. So, there's a lot of research that we're doing as well in terms of, being able to actually use virtual UTXOs and the UTXO construct in a programmable environment, which we think is actually better suited for the types of applications that we see on blockchains today, right? So every blockchain today is looking at, reducing latency and offering, instant execution and things like that. There's kind of a pissing contest as to whoever has the, smallest millisecond trade execution. And there's a lot of challenges that are inherent to global state architecture, Ethereum style architecture when it comes to that, because there's this idea of concurrency, right? And you need to update. This is why you've had chains like Monad and whatever that are attempting to do parallel execution, because the normal state of things with a system like the current rollups and Ethereum is you have to sequence everything in order, because if there's different state updates in different parts of the state, you might fuck things up a little bit. But the UTXO construct is kind of like natively parallelizable. So, we still have a lot of research and work to do in terms of implementation and getting raw numbers out the door for that. But we're pretty optimistic about the fact that, fundamentally, it's just a different game being played, because, something like Arkade does not require an additional blockchain. Therefore, you get rid of the data overhead as well, right? The data availability issue that plagues all of the rollups and things like that goes completely out of the window, and therefore you probably have better security assumption. So it's a bit of a TLDR. I don't want to get too much in the weeds of all of the technical stuff. We got docs. Yeah.
No, I think it's good. So, all right, let me see if I'm like this has been my understanding thus far. You have this operator, right? And they're called ASPs, right? Ark service providers. They act as the sequencers. Is that correct? And they're sequencing everything for the entire chain. Is that how it's going to work functionally?
That's they're actually correct. We simply call them the operator nowadays.
Okay.
There was a bit of I don't know if I want to get into that, but ASPs and Ark service provider, the Lightning ecosystem has suffered quite a bit from this sort of terminology of Lightning service provider, which introduces a bit of regulatory challenges. Right. And it feels like rollups, operators and whatnot, they seem to have gotten away scot-free for the most part.
Right,
so
exactly.
It doesn't seem like that should be too much of a concern. So anyways, there is indeed like the Arkade operator. And when we say, though, that the Arkade operator sequences trades or transactions or whatever that be, it is the case. But sequences, when you're talking about sequencing, you really you really got to think about the Ethereum model where everything has to fall into place one after the other. Right? So one transaction has to make it in one after the other. That's why that's partly why it's called sequencing, right? Whereas with Arkade, really, and maybe this is just a bit too much nuance, but again, the operator, the only thing that he does is he cosigns state updates to UTXOs, right? And therefore, multiple different sets of UTXOs from multiple different sets of users can all get cosigned and updated concurrently at the same time. And this is where you remove the bottleneck in terms of scaling. But no, I mean, for the purpose of the analogy, that's pretty much the exact same thing.
You know, if you come from the Ethereum angle, the rationale for quite some time, really since Ethereum gave up on Plasma, right? Like when they kind of gave up on a channel-based ish model, they've gone like full roll-up, right? And or L2s scaling with more blockchains. Let's put it that way, because even getting into definitionally what a roll-up is not something that's super interesting at this point. But basically, what they've done is scaled Ethereum with more blockchains. This was like their mission all along, and this has, I mean, you could say it's been successful. You could argue it hasn't been successful. We don't have to debate that. But what is the strongest argument in your mind? So, like, let's say you had to steal. Sorry, I should elaborate more. Now there are people building rollups on Bitcoin, right? Like some well-funded, very smart teams, and they're working with ZK stuff, BitVM stuff. They have taken what Ethereum has done and decided that this is indeed the way to go for Bitcoin. What is the strongest argument that in your mind, if you had a steel man, like why you would choose a rollup versus something like Ark? And the reason I'm asking is because when you say like, look, DA is not a problem any longer because there's no global state. You're not having to commit, massive batches of data to Bitcoin. Who knows how expensive that'll be? What would be the rationale to go down the rollup? Like, what does a rollup enable, at least from the perspective of, people building rollups now that Ark cannot? Like, why? It sounds like, oh, like what a fantastic, silver bullet here. But like, what are kind of the trade-offs in your mind if you had to make the argument that rollups are another, viable solution?
Yeah, I mean, I think the strongest element that you could make with rollups is also, in a way, the biggest tragedy of rollups, which is the reliance on bridges. And so, there's a lot of downsides to bridges. We know all of the downsides of bridges. But what bridges allow you to do, if I were to try and Stillman this, is making the case for what I was suggesting earlier, right? Which is that in the event that you have a malicious operator or entity attempting to reorg or, kind of mess with the sequencing, the ordering of transactions on the layer 2 off chain, then as long as that entity does not have the immediate ability to enforce ownership of the assets that they try to, for whatever reason, steal from whatever they attempted to do, they cannot get the money out of the bridge in a scenario where the optimistic proof system works well, or the validity proof system works well. So there's a case to be made that although just like in Arkade and just like in pretty much every rollup, there is the edge case where there might be reorgs. You never have full finality in the way that you have with Bitcoin, right? Or even with the Ethereum layer 1. So
but you can,
I guess
you can unilaterally bypass on Ark as well. You just have to wait, right? That's the same premise with rollups. You see what I'm saying? Like, you can withdraw your money, right? You can. Well, I know you don't like this terminology, but you can unilaterally exit from Ark, right?
Yeah, no, that's correct. That's correct. But what I'm trying to say here is that in the event that if I were to compare it to something like Ark and Arkade. With Ark and Arkade, when the operator again would attempt to collude with, because the system operates with the same the off-chain system operates with the same trust assumption as state chains and things like Spark, right? Which are maybe
Yeah.
in and of themselves a bit of a new paradigm. But the idea is that you're making transactions off chain, therefore you're chaining UTXOs just in the same way that you can be chaining transactions in the Bitcoin mempool, right? And that can be reorg until it makes it into a Bitcoin block, right? You're not getting away from that, right? Whether you're doing it in a Bitcoin mempool, whether you're doing it off chain, unless your transactions made it into an actual Bitcoin block that is mined on the blockchain, it can be reorg. Now, with Arkade, that would happen in a scenario where the operator colludes with sort of a previous owner of a UTXO in a transaction chain and would try to double spend the actual transaction that previously occurred. And in that scenario, the operator or whoever is the fraudulent entity would have the ability to directly, because of the system of Ark, which is everything is a pre-signed transaction, meaning every single UTXO that exists in Arkade has a unilateral exit pat on chain. And there is no kind of the point I'm making is there's no challenge mechanism that exists.
There we go.
Right. For someone to for the cheater to say like, hey, I'm going to withdraw that money. It's mine. And so in the case of Arkade, they're going to withdraw their money because they can literally post that transaction on chain. And then there are like a little more nuanced game theory specific scenarios where you might have the opportunity to create a kind of a bidding war because basically what happens is two people have a competing claim on the same on-chain UTXO, right? So you can kind of like have a scenario of a bidding war, but then it depends on like the kind of time locks that are enforced. But anyways, that's kind of the point I was making is the fact that the money is in a bridge and the bridge has a sort of orthogonal security mechanism that controls who can get the money in and out of that system. It can help in the case, that, but again, you're still relying on assumptions that are, not formally verified at least, so when you're talking about all of the,
right. It's not like the L1 enforces it.
No, well, they know exactly. No, exactly, exactly. So then you're relying on the proof system, meaning you're the optimistic challenge response system, and whether or not because there's so much complexity to that, right? The bonds, and maybe even though if you have if there's like $50 being stolen, maybe the system works well. But maybe if like there's $5 billion getting stolen, maybe, there's like the game theory and the economics of the proof system, they don't work out as well as expected. So, it's all very speculative what I'm saying. And there's a lot of theory and around this, but I would say that's, I guess, the biggest statement that I can make for, but bridges are also, as far as I'm concerned, the far and away the biggest downside of system like rollups, because at the same time, yes, you kind of like have this opportunity to recover funds in terms of like some off-chain reorg, but in the case of a catastrophic security bug, or in the case of then everyone loses their money. Like if the bridge fails for whatever reason. And this is why all of these systems, they still have multi-sig backups, right? They still have.
Yeah, I was going to ask. I was going to ask you about that. Is there any, just because a lot of my listeners are like more acquainted with the roll-up L2 model, whatever you want to call it, and right, all the L2s on Ethereum currently have some type of security counsel or multi-sig. Is there any corollary to that within Ark? I think the answer is no, but is there anything that is similar? Yeah, because it's all just pre-signed transactions already. So like you can always just correct. There really isn't. But we built with Arkade, one of the goals that we had was like, okay, well, since we're planning on leveraging this off-chain state execution, and there is indeed a risk of reorg in the case of the malicious actors, a malicious operator, well, certainly
there's the natural financial incentive of the operator, which should be that, well, hopefully he's making money off of that system,
Right.
but these are not always the strongest, or at least in the bootstrapping phase, these might not be the strongest incentive. But you also have the fact that, we're planning to leverage technologies like, like TEs, like so trusted execution environments, and also things like just simply bonds. So this idea that you would have the opportunity the system would effectively have the opportunity to slash the operator in the case that you can demonstrate that he attempted or he actually double spent, right? So you can introduce bonded systems like this. I have some reservations myself, even about bonded systems, because obviously it's hard to make systems like that scale, right? Like if you have 10 billions of asset, are you going to have a $10 billion bond? Probably not, right?
Right.
But something very interesting that I've been looking at, and I think that even the guys at Paradigm also, I think they published a paper on this, or something similar not too long ago, which is kind of like the idea more so like localized bonds, and it start looking more like an insurance system. Whereas myself, as an Arkade user, say I'm using the system and I'm making a set of transactions which I consider to be sort of critical, if you will, off chain, and I want to have stronger assurance about the risk of against the risk of reorg for this set of transaction. What I might actually be able to do is require this local bond. So it's not a global bond where if anything happens in the entire system, that bonds get slashed, right? It's a local bond for that specific user and that specific set of UTXOs. And therefore, what you can do then is, again, provide something that looks a lot more like insurance, right? Where the user pays a premium to be able to have this stronger guarantee. And by creating a premium, you create a revenue model for the operator whoever is, willing to put up that bond. And therefore you make it a lot more scalable, right? It's a lot more granular as to like who gets the assurance against reorg, against off-chain reorgs and whatever. And so, again, it's all in a little bit of a research phase, but I think that's a promising avenue in terms of like, mitigating, it's kind of like a security, defense, in depth type of systems where, we feel pretty good about the set of incentives of the system, because again, when you're doing reorging, when you're targeting users like that, it's not like you can wholesale take everyone's Bitcoin and run with it, right? So you can only kind of like target specific users and try to isolate them, and then you have maybe it's a user that's making a large trade, and then you can reorg it, and you're taking the other side of that trade, and you're shorting, whatever. It becomes kind of like very complex, right? So I think my basis is that at least the ROI in terms of like fraud in this system is a lot more limited than it is in a bridge-based system. Because in a bridge-based system, if you do get the keys to the vault, like you're just running off with it.
The Gwart Show is sponsored by Ellipsis Labs, who I've been following for 3 years now. They're one of the strongest teams I know in crypto. Ellipsis Labs is a small engineering team with a flat structure. They build complex systems, primarily in Rust. For engineers who like challenges, here's the kind of problem they solve. A layer 2 blockchain needs to maintain 100 million accounts and generate a state root after each transaction batch. The root must be built within 50 milliseconds. How would you design a system to ensure the root construction is fast enough? High-performance challenges are core to Ellipsis Labs' mission as they build modern crypto finance. They believe finance needs more than an upgrade. It needs a complete rewrite. The success of their first product, Phoenix V1, speaks for itself, doing over $70 billion in organic trading volume. Now, Ellipsis Labs is building Atlas, the blockchain purpose-built for verifiable finance. I know this team personally, and I like them because they're unique in the crypto space. They have a long-term focus, they work in person from their New York City headquarters, and they're here to build products that fundamentally change the world of finance. If you want to learn more about their open roles, go to ellipsislabs.xyz/careers. Yeah, I think one other thing about rollups that I would say is beneficial, and this is less technical and more just practical, is that at least a lot of the rollups thus far are EVM based, and I think there's an SVM one too. And there is like regardless of how you feel about the EVM architecture in general, there is a lot of developer talent and a lot of pre-built systems for EVM compatible chains, right? Like it is like largely dominant.
100%.
And so I'm curious, is that a like how do you feel about attracting developers who are wanting to build with this kind of UTXO model? And also, are there any is there anything that the EVM, like let's just say like a random EVM Bitcoin rollup that has some properties and people end up using, is there anything that EVM enables that this kind of arcade model cannot?
From a programmability perspective, there really isn't. There's been a lot of work on UTXO based chains over the years, outside the realm of Bitcoin.
Like Cardano?
Like Cardano, like Bitcoin Cash and things like that. Regardless of what you think about the associated token and whatnot, like it's been demonstrated pretty well that it's certainly a different architecture, and therefore developers, it's perhaps less intuitive for them because basically you don't have the as easy of an ability of deploying sort of like a stateful contract on chain that doesn't have an owner. That's kind of like the major difference. But actually, with UTXOs and with a strong enough sort of scripting language, you can have things like, recursion and covenant and introspection and all of these very fancy technical words.
Yeah.
Means that you're actually able to build kind of like finite little state machines on the UTXO format. And therefore you're able to replicate AMMs, you're able to replicate all of these things. But, there's a bit of a learning curve in terms of, certainly onboarding developers and things like that. But the point that you made about Ethereum and the EVM, while that's been historically true, and it remains true that it has, by far the largest surface in terms of whether it's documentation, infrastructure, service providers and whatnot, it feels like to me that we've gotten to a point where it's also a catch 22, because every other alternative chain or layer 2 that is deploying just ends up having copycat applications. So there's this notion of fragmentation as well, right? That is unresolved. We haven't even discussed that in the context of rollups, right? But there's the issue of fragmentation. But the idea really is that it feels like there's been less innovation even on the product side in terms of like Ethereum constructs in the line. It's like, yeah, they have a massive stack of developers, but what have they truly like innovated on, say, since DeFi summer, basically, right? And I think to close the circle on that question really is like realizing, and this was a hot topic of discussion, and I think you were involved to a certain extent on X about this recently, is like, what are the fundamental, primitives that like a blockchain or contracting system allow you to do? Well, realistically, there's probably like, a set of like 5 to 10 core functions, right? So, liquidity pools, liquidity provided, like AMMs, right? Like escrow contracts, and all of these sort of like function, they take different form depending on the system that implements them. But ultimately, it's the culmination. It's like really what we've arrived at is, okay, like all of these smart contracts are really just a way to perhaps deploy more efficiently existing financial infrastructure, right? And at the end of the day, existing financial infrastructure is also just based on very, very fundamental core primitives. And as long as you can replicate those primitives on whatever platform you're building, then most likely any developer is able to build the sort of overlay applications that leverage those things. So, on our end with Arkade, we're developing a sort of like new scripting system that is based off of Bitcoin. It basically extends the current Bitcoin script language by giving it every single thing that's on the wish list of, all of the developers has been over the years. So, whether it's covenants or things like this, or even opcat, you can use all of these things on Arcade, and therefore allow you to fully have control over the way that you're deploying the UTXOs, the underlying contracts. So there's still a bit of work to do in terms of implementing and researching this, but we're pretty excited because we do think that our primary focus will be on creating a dev ecosystem, and mainly kind of like an environment that is, again, Bitcoin native, but it is also more aligned with more modern kind of like programming environments that, yes, the Solana or the Ethereum
Yeah.
people are used to, right? So we'll have libraries of existing escrow contracts, that the things on Ethereum like Open Zeppelin and things like that, where
Yeah.
it's like all not copy paste, but like you have like a formally audited structure if you want to deploy this type of contract and whatnot, right?
Okay, so going more now into the tangibles, like what do you see as, okay, so Arcade launches, let's say within the next year or whatever, beta or mainnet, I don't know, but regardless, what do you see as like the first sort of very practical in demand application or primitive? Like where do you see Arcade starting in terms of like, you can go on Twitter and start bull posting and say like, this is why you should try Arcade? Like what do you see as the application that kind of brings people there?
Yeah, right. I mean, it really depends on the audience, right? And I
Yeah,
think for ourselves, at the end of the day, we come from, we come from Bitcoin circles. We've been Bitcoiners. We do feel like our closest immediate supporters, in a way, remain the Bitcoiners. It's a large group, and we're not trying to underestimate, the effect that they can have. And so ultimately, what we're going to market with, and what we thought was kind of like the most impactful and immediate way to demonstrate first Arcade and the concepts of Ark as a system, bootstrap the platform, is the ability to vastly improve the Lightning experience, right? And
yeah,
so there's been a lot of conversation about Lightning. Lightning is progressing very rapidly. It's Lightning is turning the corner in the sense that it's a lot more professional. It's kind of like the tourists and the amateurs that were there in the early years, running Lightning infrastructure, running Lightning nodes, have kind of like gone by. There's still a core concentration of them, and I think they're always going to remain around, because you can make the case indeed that if you want to have a truly sovereign experience on something like Lightning, you want to be running a node and all of that, but that's going to be reserved to the 0.01% of users.
yeah,
But the challenge with Lightning really has been about the distribution of Lightning to actual, ultimately millions of people and retail end users, and how are you able to achieve this without the trade-offs of custody, and there really had not been a great solution to this, I think, up until the last couple of years. There's been a lot of resources, a lot of brain power that had been dedicated to see how can you create a normal Bitcoin wallet, a Lightning wallet that people can download and be able to easily make payments and receive payments. And ultimately, it's not clear whether we've achieved this in a way that makes sense. Like, I think a lot of people will tell you, like, yeah, Lightning works great. I use my Phoenix wallet; it's self-custodial.
yeah,
I have no problem paying anyone, but it's like, hey, by the way, you're paying 0.4% on every single one of your transactions. That's a lot of money, dude. Like, Lightning was supposed to be cheap. That's a lot of money. And the reason why, a model like Phoenix, which, to their credit, really they've delivered the single best self-custodial UX experience
sure,
for Bitcoin users. But at the end of the day, they realize that having this model where every single user has a Lightning channel opened at least we went from one user having channels open with a bunch of people, quickly realized that didn't make any sense. Went to the more hub and spoke model, right, where
Right.
one user has a channel with a Lightning service provider. But that does not scale as well, right? Because if you have 1 million, 5 million users and you have to commit funds to every single one of these channels, that money becomes stale very quickly.
Yeah.
And that has huge cost, like churn cost on your business. And therefore, you have to ultimately pass that cost on to someone, and that's going to be the consumer. And therefore, it's going to make, that kind of model very expensive. So all
Yeah.
that to say is we think that something that is more swap based, something that is more like, what a couple of wallets attempted to do and have still been implementing to this day, is the idea that, well, you don't need like a Lightning wallet, right? I don't really want to care whether I have a Lightning wallet. What I want is a Bitcoin wallet that I'm able to use to pay and receive Lightning with. But it doesn't have to be a wallet that's centered around the Lightning infrastructure, right? So how do I implement that in the easiest way possible? Well, you do that by allowing to swap in and out of. So Lightning kind of like becomes like a small little feature, like Lightning. So it's more like Lightning support, and therefore you're able to scale swapping in and out of Lightning, abstracting completely the channels away from the retail users, providing a great experience at lower cost. And all of that, again, happens within the confine of Arkade's off-chain environment, meaning that you can vastly scale the amount of swaps that you can do with very little on-chain footprint. Because the problem with these current, swapping services is that ultimately, they're all hitting the chain, and this becomes very expensive. So I think overall, like the quickest and biggest impact that Ark and what we're building with Arkade is gonna have is on the Lightning network as a whole. Going to make it a lot more efficient, a lot leaner. Liquidity is going to be a lot less expensive than it has been, and that's we think a big win in terms of validation, and like an easy way for us to, I think, prove because underlying that is the swap construct, right? And the swap construct is kind of like the driver of our entire infrastructure, because then what can you do that is the exact same function that you're doing with Lightning? Well, you can do cross-chain swaps, right? And so cross-chain swaps is a massive use case. There's all kinds of very interesting companies, whether it's like Li-Fi, the guys at Garden Finance are doing really cool things from that perspective. And the issue that and I've been chatting with a couple of these people, not necessarily the ones that I named, but some people in that ecosystem, is one of the biggest challenge that they have having to deal with Bitcoin, right? Is this sort of like slow finality, right? Is this slow finality and the on-chain cost to a certain extent. Certainly, right now, obviously mempool's a little empty. Fees are relatively cheap, so it's not that big of a deal. But ultimately, when you chat with these guys, and it's like, okay, well, what's your roadmap looking like? If tomorrow fees on chain are like 500 sats per VByte, and it costs you like, $5-10 to make a Bitcoin transaction, that's really going to start eating into the margins of your users and whatnot. And there's no great solution to this, or at least there wasn't up until we introduced Arkade, I think. And again, the function is the same. You're swapping in and out of an asset. You're swapping in and out of Bitcoin in this case. And what we can allow with Arkade is much stronger guarantees in terms of fast finality, if you will. It's not necessarily going to be full Bitcoin finality, because if you want full Bitcoin finality, again, there's no avoiding having to wait for a block. But the system is engineered so that you have pretty strong guarantees in terms of fast finality, and the throughput is just unlimited, right? So cross-chain swaps for us are, it's not something that, we're not going to build that product ourselves. And perhaps we're going to catch some flack from, some of our core audience, the Bitcoiners, which we built also something for about some of the ability for our platform to support this. But ultimately, our platform is agnostic, and we think that if there's a market and demand for some activity that involves Bitcoin, right? And Bitcoin, the on-chain asset, then why would you? Because ultimately, you got to think also that, well, all of these swaps that are happening in Arcade off-chain, they're ultimately getting batched into the layer one. So you're also contributing, all of these commitment. And the interesting thing is the commitment transactions that we're doing, they're a lot more frequent. They're going to be a lot more frequent than the roll-ups commitment transaction, right? We're not trying to save. We're not trying to save fees by avoiding putting data on chain. Sure,
Right.
like we're trying to squeeze as much efficiency as possible, but it's very likely scenario that the commitment transactions from Arcade are going to be repeatedly and increasingly filling up Bitcoin blocks. And all of that might, a lot of that might come from some cross-chain swap activity, right? So, if at the end of the day, if you're interested is in Bitcoin and kind of like furthering the security model and a healthy fee revenue market for the miners, not that I have a big concern about this
Yeah.
myself, but really, it seems, it seems like it's a win-win for everyone. And perhaps the last one, like from the sets of kind of like immediate use case that I'm seeing is the other one is just lending, borrowing and
Yep.
lending. We think there's
Yep.
just a massive, massive, massive opportunity there. Whether it's sort of like just very vanilla multi-sig based with like an escrow model,
Yeah.
which there's a set of actors that are doing this, or whether it's more sort of sophisticated DLC based like Lava, like Shazan is doing at Lava, because we're again operating under a UTXO paradigm. Therefore, we're able to use all of these same types of contract, but in an off-chain way. And again, it's just the fact that ultimately, if you want to start the lending business, inarguably is probably one of the biggest, strongest growth
For
um,
sure.
kind of dynamic in the Bitcoin ecosystem. And whether that happens off chain or in a custodial setting or on chain, but so whatever the approach is, we really think that something like Arcades kind of like fills the gap of, if we start originating thousands and thousands of loans from different entities all over the world on chain, then that's going to just be prohibitive at one point.
Yeah.
And the cool thing is that an engineer or a developer, at a sort of any sort of like Bitcoin startup or even larger Bitcoin company, someone like Unchained or whatever, that is, has a pretty massive suite of product offering Bitcoin backed loan, the transition for them in terms of implementing from a technical perspective, the loan
Yeah.
product on chain versus on Arcade is just a completely seamless. It's almost the same toolkit. So it's going to be very easy. And I think ultimately it gets very interesting because even large custodians, even a Coinbase ultimately perhaps in the future might look at this and say, okay, well, at least I can kind of like segregate every user account or at least every user loan in a single UTXO, right? In a single, because you can't do that on chain right now, right? If you start, there's this notion of the UTXO set, right? And in Bitcoin, we're always trying to like manage the growth of the UTXO
Yeah.
set because there's also the notion of like, the dust output. So you want to avoid
Yeah.
creating smaller outputs and whatever. And it's a hassle to manage. But if you have, because the reason why that's important and perhaps the user doesn't even have the keys. Perhaps it still stays within the custodial, but what you can have there is a pretty neat, so like proof of reserve type of
Yep.
system, right? Where you
Yeah.
can have full transparency for those loans, because you can look at, and with Arkade, we're planning to develop like an explorer, so you're gonna have something that you can effectively look, at the Arkade system and see your virtual UTXO, even if even if you decided to trust Coinbase for it. So there's some really interesting dynamics there with that. We're talking a lot of different integration and design partners to make this happen.
Okay, I want to go back, like right when you started there, talking about Bitcoin payments, and I'll just go ahead and say I used Phoenix for a while until they banned everybody in the United States. Maybe they're back. I'm not sure. But anyways, yeah, I thought Phoenix was pretty good. I don't have that many people to pay in Bitcoin, honestly. So that was the essence of my question. But I wanted to go back to something you said. I think that, so I talk to Lightning developers, a lot of them former Lightning developers, and they talk about the complexity, and they talk about how this sort of graph onion based like routing system almost should be simple, and it's not. Like, it's complex, and when you start trying to do more things, it becomes more complex. And like what you were talking about with an LSP managing like 5,000 different addresses, it's like it's much more complicated. But what I usually hear from these developers and former developers, first and foremost, the first thing I hear is the reality is that there wasn't that much demand to use Bitcoin as a payment network, at least when Lightning was initiated, and add just a slight bit of complexity and it becomes very, very few people, right? And so I'm curious specifically with regards to payments. Like, I would personally like to be able to pay. I mean, I'm inclined to also save mainly versus spending. But if there was something like what you guys will put out, I will certainly try, right? And if given the opportunity to split a dinner somewhere with somebody, maybe next time we see each other and at a conference, like I would love to be able to pay in Bitcoin, right? Like, I think that's a cool thing, and I would do that. Maybe it's a novelty, but I'm curious if you think that the payments use case for Bitcoin, not like stable coins on Ark, but for Bitcoin, do you see that growing? Like, do you have any unique experiences, I don't know, in, some part of the world where people want to really pay in Bitcoin? Like, have you noticed any increase yet?
I mean, not really. It's always going to
Yeah.
remain marginal. I
Yeah.
think for a long time. I think we're not quite there yet. I think it's in a way this sort of eagerness that we originally had, and like I've always said, it's a blessing that we were too dumb to realize how complex the Lightning Network was,
Yeah.
because we wouldn't have never started building it, or like committing as much resources as we had. As we have building it, and sure, there's a lot of complexity there, and perhaps I'm not advised enough to make comments on the technical aspects there, but I'm sure someone could look at it and say like it could have been done a lot simpler. But ultimately, it's going to serve a massive purpose, and it's going to be, we've been saying, really, it's more likely that Lightning ends up more like a Swift based system,
Yeah.
where it serves as the back end clearinghouse for larger services that are actually the ones catering to end users. And we're seeing that play out already. It's kind of like, it feels like everyone kind of like almost agrees with this notion that, well, if you're building different systems, whether it's side chains, Ark, Arkade, and even Starknet, with their roll up on Ethereum, has now kind of like this integration where you can effectively, I think you can pay from your Starknet. You can use your Stark token to pay for a Lightning invoice. Now, the surface of people that they are actually concerned with this is
Yeah.
probably like can fit probably fit in my bedroom.
Yeah.
But yeah, so there's this aspect too. But to answer your question, really, like, no, obviously it's very clear that in the immediate future and midterm, like, stable coins have won the payment application. And
Yeah.
so, um, The
Yeah, yeah,
one, I think the one interesting angle to that, which is like, okay, when we're talking stablecoin nowadays, it's very obviously like the Tether and the circles of this world, and we are looking forward to most likely be able to offer Tether integration via Taproot asset in the near future, at least when Arcade launches. And so this is going to be an easy one for us, and we think that's going to cover a lot of the payment demand, and to be able to have also, you know, native Bitcoin to native Tether swap, no bridges. I think it's a big fucking deal. But like,
yeah,
there's a lot of like, there's massive hundreds of millions of dollars liquidity pools on Ethereum that are solely like WBTC or CBBTC and USDC or USDT, right? So there's clearly vast demand for this. Um, and allowing someone really with existing bitcoins to be able to do that without having to rely on a bridge. I think that's a big market opportunity. But the one thing that I would keep an eye on, that something that we're thinking really strongly about, and that has kind of like been dismissed, I think, in at least in the last couple of years, is synthetics, right? And kind of like a programmatic, if you will, stable coin, something that looks a little more like MakerDAO.
yeah.
And we think that there's going to be a resurgence once the proper, uh, sort of like the proper financial rails are built. We think there's going to be a resurgence of synthetic based assets, because ultimately the flaw of every attempt of those systems on, probably just something like Ethereum, is that Ethereum is kind of a very shitty collateral, really, right? It's not great, and so when they realize very quickly that make her down, whatever, it is not a great. There were technical challenges to that as well, but ultimately we're pretty convinced that once Bitcoin really is established, which it has established itself, right, as like a strong
Pristine
form of
collateral.
collateral. Pristine collateral. I was trying to avoid.
Justin
I was
Drake's
trying to.
trope.
Yeah, well, exactly. But I mean, and I think the biggest demonstration of this is selling the treasury assets, right?
Yeah,
The treasury companies, right? And when you look at what strategy is doing with this STRK, whatever it is,
the stretch one.
those
Yeah,
yeah, well, I mean, those are fixed income synthetic assets that are created effectively by Bitcoin backed collateral, right?
yeah,
And so there's no reason why you couldn't have a similar financial structure built on chain, and therefore, maybe it is the case that because the biggest question also with these uh, programmatic stable coin is it well is the scaling, right, aspect, is like, because you need to collateralize these assets, and therefore is there enough liquidity?
right.
I and it's kind of, even myself, I've always dismissed them because of this, but at the end of the day, like, is there enough liquidity? Like, there might be, right? It'll depend on the use case, right? So certainly there's not enough liquidity to cover the existing demand in the world right now today for the US dollar, right? There's not enough
Yeah,
Bitcoin collateral liquidity, right? But we're getting to a point where there's probably there's going to be very quickly enough Bitcoin liquidity to collateralize some small cap stock, right? Like in a
yeah,
synthetic
yeah,
asset way, right? Then
yeah.
that shouldn't be a problem. That should not be a problem. So yeah, I mean, obviously, in the immediate future, stablecoins in terms of payments are going to remain king. And but we do have plans, for, because the guys that I work with, the guys at Ark Labs, originally their previous company at Vulpin Ventures that were building on the
Yeah.
liquid, the blockstream liquid sidechain. They had a product called Fuji Money, which was
Yeah, I've heard of
effectively
that.
something that's a little bit like liquidity,
Yeah,
something very similar to what the Alpen guys are trying to build with the
Yep.
Bitcoin dollar. I think they're calling
Mhm.
it, right? So there is a bit of, there's a bit of credit to that idea, and whether or not it's going to displace Tether. I mean, I'm probably a little skeptical, or at
Yeah.
least certainly very skeptical in the short term.
Yeah.
But like I said, once you have the ability, which is what Arcade is all about, is really creating those rails for native Bitcoin asset and like capital allocators to be able to deploy their assets into the types of contracts that are able to manifest these products, these financial products, and earn a yield on it, right? Because that's the biggest storyline of this cycle is, I mean, it's Bitcoin treasury companies, or just treasury companies as a whole now, because they're on Ethereum, and probably by the end of the cycle, a bunch of very stupid other chains. I think there's a Telegram pawn treasury company now.
Yeah. I saw that.
But ultimately, the underlying of that is really is Bitcoin capital markets, right? Is this notion that we have $2 trillion of liquidity now? We're kind of like moving. We've had a decade more long speculative phase where we built this asset up. And then now we're at a point where, like, yeah, there's people in the world, and this is why it's getting a little wonky, right? I think this is why people are not able to rationalize almost the Bitcoin markets, because they're so big, right? Like the numbers kind of like don't even really make sense anymore. It's very hard to make a clear mental picture of that. But it is the case that there's people sitting on billions of dollars of Bitcoin, and it's like they want to do something with those Bitcoins, right? They're not like as much as the average hodler will tell you. Like, they're just not gonna put it in a corner and twist their thumb and for the next decade, waiting for hyper Bitcoinization, right? They want to be able to deploy that capital, and Bitcoin treasury companies are a massive manifestation of this, right? So how can we build this better? It's very obvious that a lot of the innovation, if you will, a lot of the first movers in this Bitcoin capital markets era were going to be traditional finance architecture, because they're centralized things just move faster, right? And especially now with the regulatory environment, like the backdrop is just perfect for them. But there's really something to be said about building Bitcoin capital markets on chain, allowing those people, because there are, like, ultimately, it's a little bit of a question mark nowadays when you look at the lay of the land of like those DeFi and on-chain systems. It's like, do people actually care about decentralization?
Yeah, let me interrupt you for 1 second, because that was like sort of the next question I was going to ask. Because okay, you go back, and I mean, you were around for this time even earlier than I was, and there was always this notion, okay, like, we're going to go experiment elsewhere. The rationale for the rest of crypto, right, was Bitcoin isn't moving fast enough to enable us to do all this stuff, and so everything is an experiment, and everything is a Bitcoin L2, and we're going to experiment, and eventually it'll all end up on Bitcoin. And this is something where I'm not sure how much conviction I had in that belief to begin with necessarily, and probably just because I didn't know, not because I had like a well-formulated technical reason for that, but just because I didn't really know what was going to happen. But I think that's something where I've shifted a bit in my thinking when I see a lot of wrap Bitcoin on Ethereum. I see a lot of Bitcoin in these treasury. I mean, you could consider these treasury companies to some extent, off chain. That's certainly, it's a wrapper. It's much more centralized than anything that's, even elsewhere. But there's a lot of Bitcoin on, there's a decent bit of Bitcoin on Solana. People are now taking out loans on Morpho on Base, which is a single sequencer with a multi-sig, and it's Coinbase backed Bitcoin, right? Like, it's about as trusted of a trust model as you can come up with. Maybe marginally more trustless than a treasury company, but I don't know that I would make that claim. I would say it's more permissionless, but not more trustless. But my point is that, like, over time, a lot of us who've been, I say us, like, Ark is a great example. Some of the roll-up teams, Alp and Cetrea, like a lot of you guys are sort of working on the premise, like we're going to bring this all back to Bitcoin. And I'm sitting here and I'm saying, maybe, but maybe Solana ends up being a Bitcoin L2. So that was a bit of a tangent, but my question is kind of like, how do you, like, what is the selling point now for, what you're talking about, like bringing capital markets back to Bitcoin versus just nobody cares about decentralization. Nobody cares if it's a multi-sig. Nobody cares if it's custodied. Why not do it on Solana? Like, how do you bridge, like the normal response is, well, something has to blow up first, right? But we keep doing this, and I'm just sitting here, and it's hard, right? Like, how do you sell someone on Ark versus saying, hey, we'll, put your money in a Bitcoin treasury company? Like, do people have to care in your mind about these like foundational ideological principles that we've had, or is there something? I don't know. It's like it's something that we've obviously we've observed it occur, so we can't deny it, and it's like something we're kind of like coping with,
Yeah, no, I mean, really, I think people do not have to care, but people have, people have different, so like incentive structures as well. And it's a very, like what you're describing right now is also kind of like a very, almost kind of Western centric, I think point of view with regards to the institutions, right?
Right. Trust.
Right? Because we have a system and an infrastructure, a regulatory framework, for good or bad. We have something that has established itself as being, although it failed repeatedly on numerous occasions in pretty spectacular ways, but it did. People still trust it, right? And so when you talk about Base, when you think about Morpho on Base, really, like, what people are trusting is not the technicals, right? People are trusting the market cap of Coinbase. It's literally what they're trusting, right? And that's fair. Like it's
right.
inevitable that we are going to have these large institutions that are going to be wanting to compete to offer financial products, based on this new landscape of assets that we have. On the other hand, there are people across the world that, for whatever reason, and non-negligible capital allocators as well, that certainly care a lot more about this stuff, and they're going to have to figure out ways to reduce the counterparty risk that they're getting exposed to here. And at the end of the day, it also does not mean that someone like Coinbase is not able to use, for example, a system like Arcade. I'm not trying to manifest anything here, really, but they're not, because ultimately the technology that we're building is kind of like just a foundationally also kind of like a backend infrastructure for people to manage UTXO assets, right? For them to manage Bitcoin, right? And so there's no telling, like, we're going to launch Arcade. Arcade's going to have its own operator, but in the same way that what was envisioned with, and what is actually kind of like manifesting with rollups or Ethereum layer 2s, right? Where you have like, Robinhood that's doing now like an Arbitrum layer 2, right? Or something like that, right? Or like the OP, is it not Robinhood and Arbitrum, something like that?
Yeah,
no?
It's Robinhood and Arbitrum for the time being. Yes.
For the time, okay. Yeah, exactly. Well, and then there's the entire kind of like OP. What is it, like the mega chain or like the
super chain?
Super chain. So well, that entire premise where the modularity argument, where different institutions and larger entities, if they have a strong enough network effect and the distribution, right? Because this is the key, right? This is what's playing out, right? I made that point earlier, but really we're going into this arc of the regulatory arbitrage play where it feels like Robinhood is just going to take all of the business, because why wouldn't they? The regulatory backdrop is perfect for them. There was this, this new SEC news that dropped where they're like, the SEC now wants every assets on chain. So, obviously someone like Coinbase, someone like Robinhood, they're going to come in and going to say, we're going to build that on-chain infrastructure.
Well, they can copy 90% of it too.
Well, exactly.
We gave it all to them.
Exactly.
We open sourced it all for them. And now they just run a matching engine the same way that they run a matching engine for their, app that they have now. So yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah, but I do think that there's an opportunity for one of those institutions, for example, to leverage again as the backend managing that that financial product infrastructure, to use something that is a little more like arcade, like Ark, like Spark is doing a great job as well. The guys at Light Spark kind of like
Yeah,
trying to push the boundary of things towards that way, where it's like you can offer products that are up to the standards of current financial products, and in terms of like accessibility, and in terms of traditional people might prefer to have to be able to even maybe call Coinbase. I don't know if people still actually do this, but call Coinbase or whatever.
right.
But because you have an infrastructure that supports the ability to perhaps remove counterparty risk,
Yeah,
it might actually be beneficial to the institution themselves, right? Because then you can create a system where it's just like, I don't know that it's necessarily, I think I'm giving a bit perhaps too much credit to these institutions and how they view things. But if there is an opportunity for them to cut costs and kind of like reduce regulatory burden by, or, regulatory costs by leveraging an infrastructure that, yes, like if maybe one user wants to remain fully custodial, and that's fine. But maybe a larger client looks at his portfolio of asset and decides that, perhaps given his current exposure, he wants to place his Bitcoin into an account that is actually some sort of multi-sig, where
yeah,
like he controls, for example, like a basic time lock multi-sig, right? So you have full self custody of the asset, but in 30 days, if you don't give any sign of life, then there's a time lock that
yeah.
opens up a new spending path, where like then Coinbase can maybe with your family take custody of the assets, right? All of these things make sense, and these guys are going to have to build this infrastructure, and I think there's going to be a lot of hybrid models, I guess is what I'm
For
saying,
sure.
right?
Hey, Will here with Blockspace Media. Did you know that we have individual feeds for all our shows? If you're watching the Mining Pod, Bitcoin Season 2, or the Gwart Show, be sure to check out the individual feeds. You can find them on your podcast player of choice, whether that be Spotify, Apple, YouTube, etc. Just type in Blockspace Media and you'll find all our shows pop up, or just type in the individual show name like the Mining Pod or Bitcoin Season 2. Be sure to hit that subscribe and give us a 5-star rating so we can continue to bring you the best content in Bitcoin.
Arkade, you guys are going to run the Arkade instance. Is your thought process, I don't know, I mean, I guess you kind of alluded to this, but I'm maybe specifically, do you expect an institution to come in and run their own separate instance of an Ark? Or is your thought, because then I guess part of the question I have there is, I think that there's this, criticism of rollups that it fragments the liquidity and there's all these bridging problems. And well, you'd run into something, assuming that there was 10, 20 different Ark instances. Well, you're going to run into similar liquidity fragmentation. It may, if I'm correct. So like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think yes and no, because ultimately, if you're able to just swap in and out of, because one of the reason why there's this fragmentation issue is, well, the reliance on bridges, right?
Right.
And so like, yeah, if you have different systems with different bridge models and whatnot, then there's limits to what you can do. But if you look at something again like the OP super chain or whatever, right? It's
Yeah,
kind of like
I
all
see.
the
Okay.
bridge, right? And everything is like
Yeah.
the majority components all use the same kind of like tech stack, right? So you don't have this fragmentation issue. But at least from the get go, we're certainly not expecting or going to encourage and encourage any sort of like institution to run their own Arkade server. I think it makes a lot more sense right now, kind of like as a singleton, like kind of like just a traditional roll up model. But the interesting thing also is maybe there's a technological path where we're able to develop something that's more like federation style, right? So this is the whole, I guess the equivalent would be decentralizing the operator or decentralizing the sequencer on rollups, right? But when you're looking at something like the Bitcoin stack, it's a lot more, there's challenges there for sure, but it's a lot more practical, I would say. And so you can get into now whether or not, JP Morgan is going to want to be in a federation with Ark Labs. That's a different conversation. But yeah, we're building certainly that, all of our stuff is open source. So it certainly is the case also that, ultimately, if we end up, making the right tech stack, then Robinhood can come in and leverage it. Hopefully by the time this happens, we're going to...
You guys have users of your own.
Well, it's not only that, right? At the end of the day, we're also a technology infrastructure company, and therefore, we're going to have expertise in terms of implementing the technology, deploying it in systems and whatnot. So there's certainly an outcome where we're able to contribute to that. It's not like we are, it's not like our entire thing is just running the operator and making fat bucks on top of that. Right?
I think like it's really interesting. I kind of got in this debate with somebody recently. I think that the original model of investing in open source tech was actually the correct model in the sense that there were Silicon Valley firms like, some of the most well-known VCs that were quite prominent investing in, Mozilla, GitLab, like these open source projects. And the way that they looked at investing in these was, okay, you're going to build like, a lot of open source infrastructure products, but what you're going to do is basically be a B2B SaaS company and help integrate this with the big tech giants and, work on on the basis that you are charging for, you're charging for a service because you're experts in it, right? You built it and you can help integrate this and customize it. And what I've always thought about a lot of what happened with crypto was, instead of, following that sort of like the way to monetize open source development, it was, we're going to hack a token onto this and call it a day. And that's where that was where I like push back on a lot of, well, this is the way we fund open source public goods, blah, blah, blah. I'm like, no. We've actually done this before. You can go and read a lot of case studies as to how this worked. A lot of these companies were quite successful. And that was really the model all along. It wasn't just, here's a little token for you, everybody gets to cash out now. It was, how do we build like the network effects amongst these massive tech giants that all use, GitLab, Linux, like all of these, like open source integrations and stuff. And that was really the way to do it, I think. It sounds like, even cryptos, I think, is coming to this realization.
That was Blockstream's. That was Blockstream's original play as well. And again, question mark as to whether or not they succeeded at that. I think ultimately it played out pretty well for everyone, all of the investors, because my feeling is that they plowed a lot of that early seed money into Bitcoin. Bitcoin was at $500. So ultimately, but we see ourselves very similarly. Like the Red Hat sort of like model, things like that. And then obviously, if we can, because there's also the opportunity of creating, it's not out of the question that we're not going to bake in our own. Like we have some ideas around kind of like our first person, like kind of like a flagship product on top of Arcade, a flagship application on top of Arcade. And so there are things like that. There are different monetization paths as far as that's concerned. But I completely agree. Like one of the things that certainly makes us a lot different than some of the competing layer 2 at the moment, whether it's when I talk to media partners or investors, is the fact that there's no token, so there's definitely no direct path to exit liquidity. In the near short term future. But I think the play is a lot more ambitious just from the fact that, we're truly bringing to the table as far as I'm concerned. Like I said, I'm really convinced the closest analogy is really what happened with ETH and rollup. But I feel like, in a way, we're kind of like doing we were kind of like manifesting the dream that ETH had with rollups on Bitcoin with kind of like a better stack, but a bit of the same tenets, So ultimately, I mean, I've always been one to pay attention to ETH because I think there's always been a lot of lessons there for Bitcoin. And I think it's paying off in ways that I didn't even really expect.
Yeah. Okay. Well, it's been fantastic. When did you say, I don't know if you can say yet, but when do you think Ark will be sort of in the public? When can we start messing around with it? Like, what is the timeline there? Arcade.
Arcade, yeah. Well, I mean, I think by the time that this is been released, it will actually have been out in the public, although perhaps without some of the people using it being even aware of it. So I'll leave it at this, but we're closing in on mainnet deployment, and we're working with partners in terms of, a lot of the integration as far as at least some of the Lightning stuff that I mentioned is done. And certainly by the end of the year, we're going to have Ark live on mainnet, Arcade live on mainnet. And then it's going to be kind of a progressive deployment of some of the more sophisticated smart contracting stuff, that we've discussed. But the bases are going to be there. The network is going to be able to be bootstrapped. And ultimately, I think this is what's going to have the biggest impact is whether or not, we gain immediate traction. And I don't think any Bitcoin layer 2 is in a sort of like situation that they can come in and kind of like change everything, from in a day. Like, it's just not going to happen. But I think there's something to be said about the fact that, I've said before, Ark is in the same cohort of like Bitcoin season 2. So like, new enthusiasm about Bitcoin layers, as, rollups, BitVM style stuff, and some of the stuff that's, already being forgotten, and that I forgot because it was just a brain fart, during the original stuff. But ultimately, because of that, even amongst sort of like, very Bitcoin aligned technical people, there's this sort of like notion of, and I think people are shell shocked by Lightning as well, right? Which is like, oh, well, standing up a layer 2 is practically impossible. We tried with Lightning, so don't even bother. So I think once we get that out of the door, get people to play around with it, feel safe about it, start welcoming and onboarding builders, then things are going to accelerate pretty rapidly.
Awesome. Okay. Where can people find you on Twitter?
Twitter's at BERGE Alex4, Burge Alex4. And we're at Arcade_OS also for Arcade. Check it out. We got a bunch of docs. We're always improving. We're going to have some presence at a couple of conferences in the next couple of months as well. And,
maybe I can convert some. Maybe I can convert some Ethereum and Solana developers for you. Hopefully.
That's honestly, let's go. That's the goal. We're not quite there yet in terms of providing them the exact 1-for-1 stack that they're used to develop, but at least there's the opportunity to build something different, right? To build not yet another so like AMM or like pale copy of Uniswap or whatever it is that they're doing. Or like certainly not like. I'm not looking forward to someone might come and build it, but I'm not out there looking for the next pump.fun to be built on the Arcade. Right.
All right. I'm going to come in and build it.